So good evening. It's April 23rd. We just started to Thursday, March the 12th was when this whole thing started in my mind, because that's when the NBA, canceled everything. And so it's been 7 weeks from then. So we're kind of progressing right along in our journey. I am going to share my screen here as we begin what was our third session of looking at the Reformation, which has been a longer session of information that we started with the Renaissance back at the beginning of the year. And if you've been with us for a while, again, I'm Carl Kriesman. I'm a professor of history at Valencia College on the East Campus. Those of you who don't know, I'm the chair for the history division on the East Campus, and it's been a joy to volunteer at Westminster on Winter Park and Lakemont for now about 5 years. If I go back and count working with the veterans, or 2 years doing this little program, which is a joy of mine on Thursday nights, and miss seeing all of your faces and being there with you in person, and can't wait for us to get back to that. And we've been bringing a lot of different topics over the 2 years, most of them history, because I've done most of these. But I had some friends lined up for us, and of course the coronavirus changed all that. So hopefully we'll get back to that and we bring in some other topics and some other people coming in. We're close to, I believe it's the birthday of Shakespeare either today or the next couple of days, and so it would have been nice. I've been trying to get one of my literature professors to come and join us. Would have been nice. We're in sort of the same time period as Shakespeare. We got another century to go here. But anyway, so we're looking at Europe right now. I was thinking, kind of in my mind planning where would we go after we finish. We probably have like 3 or 4 more sessions still to go of the Reformation. It'll take us into the 1640s and to what I think really might be considered the First World War in 1618. But in any case, we will, after that I was thinking we might go back to America and go in depth on the Civil War. So I haven't decided yet, but that's kind of where my brain is right now. We'll see how the coronavirus is treating us and kind of what we can learn from there. So just as a recap, with the Renaissance, we learned that there had been a revival and a renewal of thought and mind, and it gets expressed in a simple phrase of humanism. I actually don't like the phrase humanism, quite honestly, because I think it's misleading, and many people think of humanism as its own thing as opposed to just a term to describe the Renaissance, which is this moment when all of society is reborn and there's revolutions throughout all of society in art, in architecture, in shipping, in transformation, in science, in the stars. Literally, as I tell my students, in every phase of life, there is a revival. And it's a massively important moment for Western civilization and then ultimately through world history over the last, say, 500 years. These revolutions occurred everywhere, and then some of them are really big. There's a revolution in economics called the Price Revolution. And of course, of the exploration revolution, which eventually leads us to Columbus in the United States. The science revolution is probably one of the bigger and more important ones that we all know about. And then there's the religious revolution, which gets its own little cute name of the Reformation. And of course, that's because the desire for reform had been embedded in the Christian experience ever since Constantine had made Christianity really the state religion. It doesn't officially become the only religion for about 70 years after Constantine. But with Constantine, there's a before and an after of what Christianity was and meant to be. And we see in the coming of the Renaissance that recapturing, which is, again, what one of the things the Renaissance does, is it says, wait a minute, life in the 1400s or the 1370s, maybe it's not supposed to be this way. What was true previously? And it happens first in Italy, of course, because Rome and Athens and the influence of Rome and Athens are right there. And so they recapture the ancient. And so within religion, the same thing happens, but it really happens first in the North. And so as a recap, I want to kind of remind you that the idea of the Renaissance is this connection between mysticism and the Northern Renaissance and the Reformation. And what we covered last time was to see that the Renaissance, kind of is this idea that the human can think for themselves, that they have the ability to process, to make decisions. And in the North, meaning north of the Alps, this kind of gets wrapped up into a religious fervor among some other things that we saw, and it gets expressed in this concept of mysticism, which is the idea then if the individual can learn for herself and she can learn a scientific truth, well, then maybe she can also learn an internal truth, a spiritual truth. And in both cases, in both the Italian Renaissance and the Northern Renaissance, what is happening is a breakdown of the requirement of a, say, controlling faction. And within life, that would have been the nobility or the idea of the feudal system. And within personal life, or it would be the idea of the change within having to rely on the church, right? So if I can experience truth for myself and I can learn for myself, then I can read the Bible for myself and I might be able to find some truth that does not need the church's permission to affirm me. And so this is kind of that journey that moves us forward. Now, the previous century, since the Avignon papacy, there had been a fresh energy of reformers, first with John Wycliffe, then with Jan Hus, and Luther's in that vein. And it happens in Central Europe because Central Europe's the one place where there has not yet been this emergence of a centralizing concept that we eventually know as nationalism. They haven't gotten there yet. So all throughout the central part, from the Rhine River all the way over to modern day Poland, from Rome all the way north to the Baltic, those individual places like Hesse and the Palatinate and Saxony and Bavaria and Bohemia, they saw themselves as potentially independent on their own. Well, of course, in that same spot is the Holy Roman Empire, led for the previous 400 years by the Habsburg family. And so there's competing desires there. And it is that sense or that moment by which some of the northern princes begin to understand that they could use this to their advantage. So they do. So Luther finds success and he kind of is able to go forward then in the journey. Remember now, Luther does not really have a plan to formulate a new religion. He really wants there to be reform. And this will actually be true for all of his life till he dies in the 1550s. He's hoping for there to be still some sense of reform. He doesn't think that there should be two versions of the church. And this will be important in a moment as we see. But this is one of the reasons why he will break ranks with Erasmus. Erasmus was very much seeing this as a statement of more freedom for the individual. So the idea of the peasant being free of feudal obligations. But Luther's not having it that way. And so even as there's this revolt in the 1524-25, Luther sides with the nobility. He sides with the more, we might say, conservative structure. And so ultimately, though there is this protesting from which we get the term Protestant, Luther is only begrudgingly creating a religion, right? However, he's not the only one. And this is one of the key factors that then takes us beyond. So now tonight we're going to move beyond Luther and we're going to see kind of where is it going to go forward? And to get there, we go, and we can kind of skip this slide, we go to Switzerland. So again, remember at this juncture, as you can see here on the map, hopefully you can see my cursor on the map, all of this land that we know is actually various other states today, nations, we're all part of one big happy thing. And so including the Low Countries, modern day Belgium, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Switzerland, Northern Italy, Eastern France, all that was part of the empire. And those were all individual locales. And so in the Swiss Alps, we will find kind of the second wave of the Reformation that emerges not post-Luther, it's when Luther's happening, but it's after this initial, say, decade of Luther's success. And this takes us to three versions of the Reformation, which we will look at in depth tonight. And this first one is led by a man named Ulrich Zwingli. Now, Zwingli is a contemporary of Luther, and he is alive, he's a priest, in the Swiss cantons. I'm going to come back to this slide. Let me go down here and show you. So this is the Swiss cantons at the time of the Holy Roman Empire, at the time of the Reformation. And all the different colors you can see are somewhat independent. There are 14 separate cantons, and if you've ever been to Switzerland, or you've ever driven through the Rockies or driven through the Appalachian Mountains, you can understand how there would be villages and locations that were largely separated by different mountain ranges that allowed them to develop somewhat independently of each other. But yet they still had a kind of a combination identity. Now, again, we don't want to say there was a Swiss identity. At this point, the Swiss cantons have at least 3, if not 4 different languages. And you remember our conversation last time when we talked about nationalism. One of the things that we noted is that language is a key functioning rule or concept about creating nationalism. So the Swiss idea of an identity, to some degree, is only the mountains, the fact that they are in the mountains. But while they're developing, because they're in the mountains, they did already have some independence from the empire. So the empire exists, obviously they're part of the empire, but their relationships with the Habsburgs is a little, they have more freedom than others, let's put it that way. So not surprisingly, in the Alps, you've got different developments. And so right up here at the top is where Zurich is. Again, I hope you can see my cursor moving. And right there's where Zurich is. And Zurich is where Zwingli is located. So Zwingli is a priest, and he, like Luther, had grown up in that kind of post-John Huss feeling of the Germans not wanting to, or worried about their connection with Rome. They're worried about what's happening within the church post-Avignon papacy, where there's a lot of concern about the excesses. We saw the video last time. I'm sorry the volume was low from what I was told, but we saw the video last time of Luther going to Rome and being offended by what he saw. And just throughout the church, there was no real evidence amongst many, particularly of the high-ranking leaders, of their own spirituality. They looked very much like everybody else. And so Zwingli has the same feeling. And so one of the things that he says about Luther, and there's a debate amongst historians, and there was a debate at the time between Luther and Luther's friends and Zwingli and Zwingli's friends, was how much Zwingli was independent of Luther. As you can see, he's a couple of years after Luther when he starts really coming out, in his pulpit against the excesses of the church. He would say that he had these feelings for, a long time. He was in his 30s, obviously, going into his 40s. And so, I felt this way. And that all Luther really did was convince him to have the confidence to speak openly. Others would contend that Zwingli may have borrowed extensively from Luther. I actually think Zwingli probably did feel the way that he felt without Luther. Again, the ideas of frustration about the church connected to the mysticism, connected to Erasmus. So Zwingli, some other who we're going to meet tonight, they're all to some degree students or following in the wake of Erasmus in his criticism of the church. So I think it's fair for Zwingli to say that he was just feeling his own way. In 1519, 1520, he actually takes the very bold step of saying he was going to move away from the prescribed Mass. And if you ever go to an Orthodox or a high church, so Episcopalian church, many Methodist churches, the Catholic Church, the priest and all the churches, all the buildings and groups that meet are almost always speaking on the same passages because they're working from a prescribed passage for that day. And they can actually look in the Methodist Church, for instance, it's the Book of Common Prayer. The Anglican Church, they have a Book of Common Prayer. The Catholic churches that call it that. And Zwingli says, I'm just going to abandon that, and I'm going to start teaching directly from Matthew, kind of as a humanist, as a scholar, going deeper and deeper into the text. What does the text say, without trying to limit it into kind of a nice contained structure around the Mass, which for the humanists in Zurich, that was amazing. They were excited. For others, they were not so sure. And so Zwingli begins to move in the same journey as Luther. He has a few meetings similar to what Luther does. He doesn't get as much direct attention from the Pope, because obviously the Pope and the papacy is focused more on Luther and what's happening in the empire. Zwingli does not get the same focus from the emperor. Charles V, of course, is involved in his geopolitical struggles with France and the Ottomans, but then he's more specifically focused with what's happened in Saxony. In 1524, Zwingli writes his own work called the 67 Conclusions. If you remember what I told you last time, for Luther's 95 Thesis, it's not like he had 95 distinct arguments. He has like 8 or 9, in which after each argument, Luther wrote another sentence, ultimately numbering 95, that explained, more in depth, kind of like how we write a paragraph and you'll have a thesis statement in your paragraph, your main idea of your paragraph, and you'll write 2 or 3 sentences explaining your paragraph. Well, Zwingli does more issues in his 67 Conclusions. However, there's still a lot of commonality between him and Luther, which again, back to the point of people saying maybe he just borrowed directly, from Luther. So again, here's the map. There's up here Zurich. Switzerland's going to become very important. We're going to show you this later, but down here Lucerne, up here Basel, way down here is Geneva. These are all going to be very important points as the Reformation begins spilling out through the Alps into different iterations. All right? Now, theologically, we would say that Zwingli is a more moderate form of Lutheranism, and as we'll see in a moment, he's actually much more determined to kind of create a separation of church and state. They won't go as far as the Anabaptists, who we'll meet in just a second, but he's not, I would say, as theologically concerned as Luther is. Now, in 1529, so we're 12 years since Luther, one of the key princes, German princes, a man named Philip of Hesse. Now, Hesse is north of the Alps on the Rhine River, about maybe 150, 200 miles north of Switzerland. And he becomes one of the reformers. He becomes somebody who agrees with Luther and with Zwingli. What Philip of Hesse is thinking, again, evidence of the nationalism thought we talked about before, is that he's noticing that amongst the Catholic princes, so again, his peers who are staying connected to the Catholic Church, as well, obviously, as the Holy Roman Emperor, the Habsburg family will stay solidly Catholic. They've become more united and at various moments seem more prepared to go to war. And in fact, in June of that year, the first war of religion connected to the Reformation had already happened in the Swiss Alps. So let's go back to the map for a second. This section that I've drawn for you here in blue, which is Lucerne and Obwalden, Uri, Swiss, Zug, these cantons had all decided to unite. They'd remain Catholic. And they did not like the fact that coming from Zurich, Zwingli, either directly or indirectly, had, missionaries going out and kind of spreading his teaching to, the neighboring cantons. And so there initially was a little bit of a struggle between these guys in 1529. There turns out not to be a major battle fought in this first of what's known as the Capelle Wars. That's for an area where there'll be a battle in the second one of these wars. But at this initial stage, they're able to talk things out, work things out between Zurich and, the neighboring cantons, and ultimately, avert battle. But for Philip, he sees this as a warning. And so at this moment, when there's really just two versions of the reform happening, he thinks it's vital for this to be united. So he tries to get both Luther and Zwingli together at Marburg. It's a city, and it's called the Marburg Colloquy. And he wants to have them, talk through issues and ultimately get on the same page. Then they do come close. They do come close, but they can't get all the way there. And Luther, to his, as we've already said, is somebody who wants there to be compromise. And at the same time, he's not just going to give in on things. And we're not going to go into too much depth here. We could have a religious conversation, which maybe some of you have asked me for later, which we could go much deeper on this point. But the real sticking point is what to do with the thing called the Lord's Supper. Now, if you're a Christian, you know this. If you're not a Christian, you probably know this. The idea of Mass itself is around this concept of the common meal that the early church had together. And if you know the story, we just celebrated Easter. You just may have gone to a Maundy Thursday celebration, or you've heard of Good Friday. Somewhere in there, you know that there's this meal that Jesus has with his small group of devoted disciples. And it goes down in history as the Last Supper. And Da Vinci paints this really famous painting about it. Different churches will call it different things like communion or the love feast or the Eucharist. These are all terms for the same thing. Well, in that moment, not to get too into the weeds, Jesus says something unique in that he says the bread, because he took bread and broke it, and he says, hey, this bread is my body. And then later he takes a cup of wine and says, hey, this cup is my blood. Well, what does he mean by that? And I'm not going to give you my take on it, and not expecting you to chime in with your take. But as you might not be surprised to know, followers of the Christian faith have not always agreed with what did Jesus mean. And so this may seem esoteric to you and me, particularly if you're not a Christian at all. It probably seems really weird. But that became a real central dividing point amongst all the Christians. So the Catholic Church had a very specific view on it. Luther took a separate view on it, and Zwingli takes yet a third view on it. John Calvin, who we'll meet in a moment, he takes a fourth view on it. So you have these competing views from which, if you weren't a Christian, you're like, hey, y'all can kiss and make up and worry about do the meal the way you want to do it in your building. But that was not the way they looked at it. Remember the debate of the second video that we saw when the Pope's representative is accusing Luther, you are obligated already to believe, and you wait in vain for a disputation. And so and you probably have something you believe very deeply in, whether it's your favorite sport or your favorite drink or something to do with the government of the United States or something maybe within your specific field in which you and other experts in your field may not have come to an agreement. And then you kind of just get frustrated because why won't they do it that way? In any case, this becomes the real sticking point. Luther actually will write for Philip a document that says, hey, here are the things we agree with. And I think there are like 15 points. And on 14 of the 15, they're in agreement. But at the end, he's like, yep, but we can't agree on what to do with the Lord's Supper. So we're going to go our separate ways. So Philip's hope of uniting the reform fails here. And if there's any criticism of the Reformation from a Christian point of view, I would only offer that the church, when you read the Bible and you read what Jesus said, the one thing he talked about was he wanted all of his followers to be united. And already at this point, we have two faiths. You have the Catholic faith, the Latin, and the Orthodox faith, the Greek. So they've already split back in the 1000s. And now you've got a third with Luther, and now you're going to have a fourth with Zwingli. Now, you may be saying to yourself, wait, Zwingli's a name I've not heard. I've heard of some of these others. Well, Zwingli is the one of the early Reformed churches that doesn't exist today. As far as I'm aware, you will find no, First Church of Zwingli anywhere in the world. All the others still exist, some of them very specifically. So there are several Lutheran churches throughout the world, in the United States, of course. And some others that you may not know that they exist, but I promise you that they do, which I'll introduce to you in just a minute. Part of why that doesn't happen for Zwingli is what happens next. After the colloquy fails, Zwingli goes back to Switzerland, and while he's there, the Second Capelle War happens. The cantons grew more frustrated as the reformers, kept pressing. And we'll back up just a second. I'll come back to this slide. Let me show you this. If you notice here in this bullet point, Luther again wanting moderation, But Zwingli was already seeing a future where the reform could only take place if they fought for it. That was another place where they disagreed. And perhaps Zwingli was prophetic, which again, within a year and a half of the meeting, there'll be a second attack. The 5 Catholic cantons, they decide they're going to put an end to this. They launch a surprise attack, and on October 11th, at Capelle, which is a city right there that X is, just north of Luzerne, the Luzerne canton, about halfway between Luzerne, the city, and Basel, they fight a battle. And the Zurich army is undersized. They weren't really ready. And in that process, they will be defeated. And many of the city leaders, to their credit, were out there fighting, including Zwingli. And Zwingli will be wounded. He will be discovered on the battlefield. And when he is discovered, as this painting depicts here, he is executed without a trial. So that's another reason why Zwingli, you don't have a First Church of Zwingli or Zwingliism, is because it's not long enough, and then the leader himself is executed, But it's also not something that stays with us today, because in Switzerland, out of Zurich, there is a third iteration. So while he's initially teaching from 1520 to 1530, he draws a very strong following in Zurich and from other surrounding areas. And one of the people who came to follow along beside Zwingli was Conrad Grebel. Now, Grebel was someone who thought Zwingli was moving too slow. Of course, so then you know what he thought about Luther. Grebel was not someone interested in reform. And again, I want to reiterate, this takes us back to this kind of key point of why does the Reformation happen now and why in the North? Because of the Northern Renaissance. If anyone can read the Bible, then anyone could read the Bible. And no one could then say, you're not allowed to read. Luther could not say, Zwingli could not say to someone like Grebel, hey, wait a minute, you can't say that or you can't do that. Once you open that Pandora's box that says it's not a secret document controlled by an elite, the priests, the bishops, the cardinals, but it's really for anyone to read, well, then interpretation is open to anyone, which is why, according to some experts today, the Christian faith has upwards to thousands and thousands. I mean, I've seen a high number, which I actually don't believe is accurate, but tens of thousands of denominations or iterations, of the faith. Grebel will form a group called the Brethren in 1524 while he's still in Zurich. And one of the pieces that Grebel believed in was that baptism, which is another one of the key things the Christians do, could only be done by an adult, by someone who was able to mentally assent to what they were being asked. Now, if you go back to Constantine yet again, now this is actually the road to the issue around purgatory. Here's how it goes. With Constantine and then post-Constantine, the church moved to a place where the only baptism, or the majority, the 99% of baptism, occurred with infants. And some of you may have gone to a church for your own children or for your grandchildren or a friend and saw the child baptized and christened. And at that moment, according to the Catholic Church and other churches that baptize infants, the child is in a state of under grace. If something tragically happens to the child, they're going to heaven. And then, of course, as you know, or may have experienced yourself personally, at the age of 12, that same child will go through a thing to confirm the baptism, confirmation, which again, you may have heard of or may have experienced. Well, of course, as we know when we look around the world, when you can think about a place like Europe in the 1200s or the 800s, where every person alive could claim to be a Christian because they all would have been baptized by the local priest. Nobody would have escaped it, right? Everybody was in. And you know, though, that not everybody as an adult would live their life well. There's always in the human story murderers and liars and killers and thieves and people who are, gluttons for money and gluttons for food, et cetera, et cetera. So the church had to figure out, well, how do we deal with that? If we have everybody that we're claiming are Christians and ultimately going to heaven, but you got a ton of people who are not really good people, they're not living right, what do we do with them? And that's where they kind of constructed this idea of purgatory, which again, as we said last time, I'm trying to step on anybody's faith view, but that's just not in the Bible. But it makes sense why they came up with it. So Grable's position is you don't need purgatory because none of these people who got baptized as infants are actually Christians, because they couldn't be Christians because baptism is only for an assenting adult. Now, whatever the age of adult is, it's a whole different conversation. Well, this idea of baptism lead him to offer and perform, you see there in January of 25, an adult baptism. It might have been the first adult baptism in all of Europe since the early days of the Christian faith. So, 100, 200, 300s, when they still would have had adults converting. This was the shocker, and it's from this that we get the name of his faith called the Anabaptist. Now you can see right here the letters A and A. That's the Greek prefix. If you read Greek, Anna is the one that means re, R-E. So in a derogatory or a descriptive but negative descriptive way, the people in Switzerland began calling Grable and his followers the rebaptizers or the Anabaptists. Now, Grable and the others after him, they never really called themselves that. And you'll get a long debate in theological Christian history terms, if you want to go down that road, about whether these are related to our Baptists that you may know of in our country, the American Baptist, the Northern Baptist, the Southern Baptist, and we're not going to go down that road. But Grable at least might have considered himself a baptizer of some kind. I think if you'd asked him, he would have just said he was a member of the Brethren and would have not had the word Baptist involved. Well, the Zurich City Council, with Zwingli's approval, says, nope, can't do that. And if we find out you did it, either you gave somebody a baptism, that's really aimed at Grable, or you received baptism, that is a capital crime, and we will execute you. And the way they were going to do it in a kind of ironic, kind of gross kind of way would be they would drown you. So the drowning would be a way to kind of, you want to be baptized, we'll baptize you. You'll go straight to heaven that way. Or in their minds, you wouldn't go to heaven at all. This issues about a decade of persecution at the Anabaptists. And this is a moment when you can begin to see some of the Anabaptist teaching shifting to a church and state separation, which is really, they're going to be the strongest ones saying that there should be, when they mean by this is they want protection from the state, the government attacking them. And you'll also see the beginnings of pacifism, which becomes really the principal aspect of the Anabaptist teaching. In 1534, largely having fled Switzerland, I'll go down a map and I'll come back. So here you can see where some of the key places are where the Anabaptist faith, and so initially it would be all down here in Switzerland. But notice something, here's the Rhine River, right, here's Strasbourg, here's Worms. The Rhine River becomes a central kind of highway for the Swiss Reform movement, as opposed to the Lutheranism, which will be all up in here, and then down here in the south of the empire will stay very strongly Catholic, right? Well, here's the city of Munster, right, which is in northwestern Germany. In Munster, two of Grable's disciples, Grable passes away at this point, Jan Matthias and Jan Buchlesk will lead a group of Anabaptists. And here's the one place where the Anabaptists will take over a city in Munster in 1534. They proclaim it the New Jerusalem, and they try to basically take over the city. Now that obviously is the opposite of church and state separation, right? So we can see that these guys maybe are on a different path. And I think that's a useful moment to say within the Anabaptists, and then largely I would say within the Reformers at large, you simply never see a consistency that you would have seen previous to the Reform, again, for the reason I already said. If anyone can read it, the Bible, then anyone can understand it, and anybody can then decide for themselves what they think. In that place, you can see that Munster becomes kind of like a theological civic society, and they will really try to go out of their way to kind of make Munster independent. But notice what happens. Again, the Anabaptist or the rebaptizing issue was so offensive to the Lutherans as well as the Catholics, who were still at that point baptizing their children. I don't know what Lutheranism does today. I think they baptize their children still, but they certainly were baptizing children at that point, the babies, the infants. That the city of Munster was attacked by a combined Catholic Protestant army because they did not want this to spread, this disease, this idea to spread. And they were successful. And so the Anabaptists, both the Johns are killed. The Anabaptists, they are largely stamped out of Munster. And at this point, the Anabaptists go underground, and you really lose them as a driving force in the story. But you know them, right? So these are all names of groups that exist today that all have their lineage either directly. So like the Swiss Brethren here on this list are really the direct descendant back to Grabel's initial group. There is actually an Anabaptist church. There are Anabaptist congregations here in the United States. The more famous of the descendants are the Mennonites. Somebody may know of the Hutterites. They're more of a European thing. And then, of course, the Amish. There's a couple of steps to get to for the Amish from the Mennonites, Menno Simons, Jacob Hutter. They were both in Munster. And they will, escape the tragedy there. And they'll be the two that really will lead the Anabaptists into a completely pacifist viewpoint. All right, so third one up then is the most famous and the one that has the greatest legacy, and that's John Calvin. Now, Calvin comes to us from France. So France at this point is also experiencing the Northern Renaissance. There's also this kind of growth of the humanist viewpoint. Mysticism is certainly flowing through France, particularly in the north, up near Paris. Erasmus is very famous. Calvin considered himself a descendant or a student to some degree of Erasmus. He, like Luther, will become a priest, and then he'll change gears. Unlike Luther, who leaves law, Calvin will study law and finish. And then eventually in 33, he'll go back to Paris. Now, so get your chronology in your head. 1517, Luther does the thing. 1520s, you've got Luther and Zwingli happening. Late 1529, the Capel War. 1531, the Second Capel War, Zwingli's killed. The Anabaptists are really starting to roll. So Calvin is behind them, not a whole generation, but he may be a whole generation. He's certainly 10, 15 years younger than Zwingli and Luther. So Luther's influence would be in France. Now, to this point, France is not really having any Reformation movement. We're going to come back to France when we do the wars of religion later. But at this point, France they know of what's happening, but they're not really interested. France has a long, direct history with Catholicism, and that's going to largely hold true. So when he goes back to Paris, Calvin, like Zwingli, has begun to hear more of Luther and believe that this really is something that he agrees with. When in 1535, the University of Paris got a new rector, and he was going to give a speech and kind of an inaugural address. And he worked with Calvin to write the address. And you can see there a quote from the speech, and you can see in that quote how, at least for Calvin, and I think the rector himself, has really come out on the side of Luther, that there is this excesses, there's a problem. You see them kind of calling out the idea of grace, calling out justification, which is where Luther went, justification apart from any activities. You don't have to buy indulgences. And so, ta-da, we're going to make this statement. Well, but unlike what Luther experienced, where he was protected by the city fathers, Calvin and the rector of the University of Paris, they're not protected. City officials come, they want to arrest them. They're probably going to try to put him to death for spreading these heretical ideas. Both men will flee the city, and this is where Calvin will make his way to Switzerland. So back to the map for a second. He goes up here to Basel. So he comes out of Paris, out of France, and makes his way to the edge of the cantons and lands in the city of Basel. So now Basel as a canton had not been involved in the wars with Zurich, but certainly the ideas of Zwingli had already gotten to Basel. Zurich and the Zwingliites had, spread throughout the area. So Calvin comes to Basel to lay low. Now we're not sure what he was planning on doing, but while he's there, he will take time to write what is considered the hallmark and the strongest theological work of the Reformation. Remember, Luther writes basically a complaint of 8 or 9 main ideas supported by, 85 or so other supporting concepts. It gets printed, but not by Luther's desire. And then Luther, as we know, writes other pamphlets that could collectively be made like a book, but he never tries to write like a book, right? Zwingli writes his 67 conclusions, but again, now in his case, he gets killed, but he's not out there writing a theological treatise, theological structure, or what's often called a systematic theology. And the Anabaptists, they never really wrote anything of major significance. I mean, they had some writing, certainly, but there's nothing that really stands out to us. In 1536, Calvin writes the book that is still with us today. You can go on Amazon right now and buy a current copy of the Institutes that he writes. It's considered by many to be the finest writing, perhaps of all Christianity, certainly of the Reformation. And as opposed to Luther and Zwingli, where there's just like this list of complaining, what Calvin does is he writes a systematic theology. What do the reformers think about God? What do the reformers think about Jesus? How do they understand grace? What's the job of the Christians? And ultimately, and again, we could go down this path much deeper than this. We're not going to. Calvin's theology gets whittled down if you read the Institutes, and some will say this is too simplistic, into these 5 points that seminary students, to try to memorize this, use the anachronism of a tulip. And it means, as you can see here, total depravity of the human, unconditional election. If you know your Calvinism or your Reformed theology, you may have heard of, wait, isn't Calvinist the predestination guy? That's him. Limited atonement, irresistible grace, and preservation of the saints. Now, again, we're not doing a theology class, so I'm not going to go deeper on those. I could, but we're not going to. But again, the key point for you to understand is that Calvin is writing a systematic plan for what it means to be a Christian. All Luther really did is say, hey, all the abuses of Catholicism, I don't like those. And then later, he's like, well, if I'm going to have a church, I guess I sort of ought to figure something out and give some guidance. But he never really, Luther, lays out a systematic expression of what he perceives. I mean, even the debate between him and Zwingli was one that certainly he understood what he believed about the Eucharist, about the idea of the Lord's Supper, but it wasn't like he walked in with the book to Zwingli and said, hey, here, or vice versa. These are just two guys who are deep in the faith saying to each other, well, I think this, well, I think that. Calvin, in this year where he's kind of laying low and hiding, he changes his name a couple of times, he's really trying to not get arrested or killed. Calvin is going to use this time to construct a framework for his view. Now, if you look at communion, as you can see here on the slide, he's between Zwingli and Luther, so there's kind of option number 4 of the different ones. But the biggest point for Calvin is that he comes up with a very strict standard of morals. And this will become a key point in the journey for Calvin as he's going along. Now, after he writes this, his fame gets noticed. People begin talking to him. And at one point, he was traveling south along the French-Swiss border really the French Holy Roman Empire border, and gets to Geneva. So that's way down here at the bottom of the very edge. Savoy is right over here. And this actually had been a place where the Duke of Savoy had been trying desperately to take this part of the canton away, because you see it sort of sticks out here all by itself. The Genevites had accepted some of Zwingli's reforms, but it was young, right? It had not been going for very long. And when one of the reformers within Geneva found out that Calvin was actually in the city spending the night, they begged him to stay. So he does. And from 1536 to 1538, he will begin a process of becoming a player in the city. Now, unlike the Anabaptist, he does not believe in church and state separation. He's much more in the historical alignment of religion and the leadership of the city should be deeply intertwined. I think I've told you this, guys, before, but remember, when we talk about church and state separation, the idea of a religious faith should be separate from politics. That makes us the weirdos of history. I'm not saying that we're wrong. I'm just saying when you do a study of history going back to, the beginning of known human history, 6,500 years or so ago, all those people would look at us as weird and say, why would you not want the influence of your spirit, whatever that may be, in your political decisions? Now we have an answer for that, or I think many of us could give an answer for that. But so Calvin's in the historic view of no, we want to make this combined, and he attempts to take over the city's city leaders, but they're not sure they want to go that way. And so ultimately in 1538, people get frustrated with Calvin and they expel him from the city. He will go north along the Rhine River to the city of Strasbourg, which I showed you on that other map. There, another reformer who's not really in this upper level, Martin Bucer, has been leading the reform in Strasbourg. Calvin says these 3 years are the best 3 years of his life. He basically becomes the preacher and the priest or the leader of the French-speaking citizens in Strasbourg. Bucer and he have a really good relationship together. Calvin writes a lot more. He travels and speaks some. And as he speaks, his intellect becomes well known. And so his fame begins to spread to the point that in 1541, the fathers from Geneva come back to him and say, hey, we would like for you to come back. They're under pressure from Savoy, and they're under pressure from Catholic forces and influences, and they think that Calvin's their best bet to stay independent and stay in the reforming, protesting strain. So he comes back. He will get full reign over the city council. The city council will adopt, as you can see there, the ecclesiastical ordinances, and they will basically restructure their city, rules or constitution. Or Winter Park, we have a charter. We just voted on some things back in March to potentially change, aspects of the charter. They changed their whole thing. And in it, they basically turned the city over to Calvin. Now, because they did this does not mean that Calvin or all of the Geneva citizens loved it. They did not, because you can see it's very strict. They regulated the taverns, they regulated drinking, they regulated swearing. You could, be arrested for swearing. You could be arrested for dancing. And so it was very, very strict. And for, about a decade, there's a fight between the city leaders or the members of the city and Calvin. But ultimately, he'll win. He'll win to some degree because of what happens with Michael Servetus. You see this name down here? This is actually a Spanish man who wasn't specifically from Geneva, but he specifically came to Geneva to oppose Calvin. And there's a whole conversation, again, down the religious journey of Calvin's strictness versus a more liberal point of view. Ultimately, Servetus, who had some other pretty heretical views about Jesus, Calvin will be able to kind of tie him to those things, and he will be executed in the city. And so by 1555, Calvin's fully in control. And this is important this year because what we're going to find as we go forward is that the Calvinists will become the leaders of what happens in the rest of the Reform movement. The whole Reform movement will really move from Luther, who had passed away, and thus Lutheranism, into the Swiss Calvin area. Now that's also because of what happens in Germany, which we'll get to in a minute. But just to show you the spread of Calvinism, these are all really familiar names to European history. Certainly John Knox becomes critical for Scotland. He's the one that called Calvin's Geneva the perfect school of Christ. The Dutch, which will begin an 80-year independence journey that will end in 1648, their Reformed church all is reflected back to Calvin's Reformation version. You know the Puritans from our English story, or from our American history story. They're not really about us at this point. They're a reflection of the journey, which we'll look at next time, of what's happening with the Reformation in England. But during Queen of Mary the First's reign, 1553 to 58, they will flee England and ultimately go to Geneva to try to learn from Calvin. And then, not surprisingly, because Calvin's from France, the French version of Reformation will only be Calvinism. And then they'll get a really unique name, the Huguenot, which you can see there, that word with an H. But again, that's a Calvinist version. And the Calvinist version and his control of Geneva comes at this critical moment, because when you study the Reformation around the 1550s is when we see the beginnings of the real warfare that occurs in kind of embedding a national story with a religious story. Let me show you really briefly, just a few more slides, about kind of the other side of that story, because what happens for Calvinism is Calvinism becomes the most militant of the reformers. He's determined to defend his position. He's got a very specific theological framework in his institutes. He will send, he doesn't really send missionaries. He sends diplomats throughout all of Europe, trying to influence civic leaders, teaching young people. This is all while there's the one moment when the Germans really go at it amongst themselves in the 1540s and 1550s. And you'll notice in the same year it's considered that Calvin has full control in Geneva is the same time of the Peace of Augsburg. And as we saw already in our study, the Peace of Augsburg is this moment when Charles V largely gives up and says, okay, look, to the German princes, you can just do what you want to do. But notice what they do. There's only two choices. Calvinism is not included. The Anabaptists, Minnow Simons, Hutterites, they're not included. You could be Catholic or you could be Lutheran, but that's it. And you can only do those two things. And so Calvin, perhaps believing that his is the most intellectually vibrant, is obviously frustrated by this. So this is that moment where you can see that we're going to keep going forward in this debate. And Calvin is met by his intellectual and energetic equals in the Catholic Jesuits. Now we get to the Jesuits because what's happening at the same time is there's one last moment at compromise. The Council of Trent, which as you can see is almost a 20-year journey, and it's actually 3 separate meetings that span these 20 years, was initially an attempt at compromise. And they invite Luther and they invite, Lutheran thinkers to come. It's really that disputation that Luther had wanted 30 years before, and had the Pope at that time offered it to Luther. We might not even be talking about the Reformation. Now 30 years has gone by, too much has changed. Luther won't go, he's sick. As you can see, he dies the next year in 46. And because Luther won't go, some of the Lutherans that do go pretty early feel like the offers from the Catholic Church are too little, and so they will leave. So the latter part of the Council of Trent is all just, Catholic leaders and thinkers considering what needs to happen. But to their credit, they are doing some reform. There are reform efforts made, but they reaffirm some of the key things that bothered Luther and the other reformers: the 7 sacraments, the indulgences, which really means purgatory. All that's still included, and that would have been a non-starter in a negotiation for those guys. But again, there were some things that happened that were reform oriented. But what also happens is the Catholic Reformation, this reforming movement, which you see mostly in Spain. Spain is where there's this real driving force to, one, protect Catholicism, but also clean it up from the excesses that Luther had correctly seen. Well, you then see it morph over to a counter-reformation. So you go back in our mind to what we said about Zwingli, that Zwingli was saying, look, there's going to have to be a battle over this. Well, unfortunately, he was right. People at that juncture, at least, weren't just going to give up what they believed to be most important. And the Catholic Church had every right to defend itself, and it was determined to do that. So you can see that they established seminaries to really strengthen the teaching and the intellect of the priests. Remember some of the early meetings that Luther had with supposed Catholic leaders? He really embarrassed them because he knew more than they knew. He was that sharp. And Calvin certainly is very intelligent. Well, they wanted their leaders to be equally as intelligent. You notice also that they instituted the Index of Prohibited Books, which we talked about that last time also. But understanding, as they're looking at the institutes, they're looking at the 95 Theses, to the Catholic point of view, these are dangerous books. And so they wanted to have a list that they could tell a good Catholic, hey, don't read this. But most importantly, out of the Council of Trent comes the Jesuits. And the Jesuits largely need to be seen as the counter to the Calvinists. Now, Ignatius Loyola is not formed at the Council of Trent. You can see that he creates a Society of Jesus in 1534, literally right after Calvin had left Paris, right? He's a former soldier, and so he creates kind of a very energetic, active version of the faith, which in your mind you just go, wait, that was what we just said about Calvin. Exactly. It's exactly what we said about Calvin. So at this moment, when the Peace of Augsburg might suggest that we could see some calming of the waters, hey, different leaders, pick your thing, do what you want to do, nobody's going to judge you, right? And Charles V retires off to the monastery. At that very moment, you've got two men like Loyola and Calvin who are coming, and they're vibrant, they're intelligent, they're energetic, and they're determined. And so this is going to lead to the clash as both groups become really militant in defending themselves and impressing their agenda forward. The Jesuits will basically match the Calvinists in sending diplomats out and sending teachers out and working with the nobility to try to teach their kids. So you can see there's going to be this coming clash as the Catholic Reformation shifts over to a counter-Reformation. We want to turn back and counter the Reformation, and that will ultimately lead to kind of the showdown that we will look at next time when we talk about the idea of the wars of religion. And so with that, I think that's a good place for us to stop for the night. Next time, we're actually not going to do the wars yet. We're going to do Anglicanism, which I think will take us the whole time. By the time we bring Elizabeth into it and talk about what happened with their faith journey. I'm not sure if it'll be next week or the week after. I'll work with Becca to get the right time for that and try to get the information out to you a little sooner than I did this week. But before I leave, as always, I want to see nobody's typed any questions to me, which is totally fine. But if anybody had any question they wanted to ask, we'll pause just for a second. Now I'm going to quit sharing my screen so you guys don't have to sit there and stare at all that, and see if anybody has anything they want to ask me as we wrap up for the night. Well, I appreciate you being with me.
Well,
I hope you, go ahead. Somebody wants to, Jocelyn, want to ask me a question?
I'm sorry, just quickly, well, I don't know. The Council of Trent, did that sort of launch the Inquisition? When was the Inquisition? I mean, you talked about the Jesuits and
Yep.
I understand the Dominicans were also founded as an anti-Reformation movement. But when did that Inquisition kind of attitude, if you like?
Yeah, no, good
start?
question. There's like two, I would say there's two, you can answer it one of two ways, right? So on the one hand, out of the Council of Trent into the Counter-Reformation, there is a very specific thought of re-energizing the Inquisition and using it as a way to well, we would say coerce or even torture someone into a faith position, right? And so it does feel like that there's this thing that's launched at this moment. So the Index is launched, the Inquisition, the Jesuits.
Yeah.
But remember we also said 2 times ago, I think it was, that from the moment of Constantine, there had been demands of reform. And the church, the official church's position, the way I describe it, was always either to co-opt and bring it under their umbrella. So the Dominicans who you mentioned, or the Franciscans, or the different monastic movements, or Cluny, all these were reform movements that ultimately get kind of swallowed up by the church and then to a large degree muted in their ability to reform, or crushed. The church either co-ops or crushes. Well, that idea of crushing is the Inquisition. And so the idea of church leaders arresting someone, trying them, perhaps torturing them, using pain as a method to force a recanting of something, as we saw in the video clip last time, Luther, will you recant or not? That idea, that predates Council of Trent. It's really an old idea and not limited at all to Christianity, unfortunately. So it's really two answers. You're right that there is this moment coming into the Counter-Reformation where the church is looking, the official, church from Rome is looking for all the tools possible to try to bring people back to the fold. And the Inquisition is one of those. And at the same time, the idea of the Inquisition in Spain and elsewhere predates that, was being used at other points.
That's interesting. I didn't know that. Thank you.
You are so welcome. Well, thank you guys for being with me. I really appreciate it. I hope you have a wonderful night, and I'm going to stop the recording now and appreciate you guys. Have a good one. Be safe.
Thank you.